This conference will now be recorded.
Yes. Anyone, any questions, guys? Firstly, before I get started, any questions, any challenges that you're facing, anything that you're facing, any questions here?
Yes, sir. Good morning, sir. Kalyan here.
Good, please. Glenn.
Uh, sir, I observed that when I was open at WinCT, it takes me to login page, right?
Mm-hmm.
At that corner side, the port number is given like call 22.
Mm-hmm.
So what it represents, sir?
It represents on which port you're talking to. Did you hear about RDP called 3389?
Yes, yes,
Uh, right. In the same way,
yes, sir.
FTP works at a port called 22. So RDP, since RDP works at a port called 3389, you're just sending an RDP request to that particular machine at 3389 out here, wherein you're trying to, let's say, send an FTP request, file transfer protocol request at the port number called 22 out here. So port number 22 is a representation for FTP.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, I have one more question.
Good, please.
Uh, if I have a pay-as-you-go subscription model, I am
Hmm.
scale up from basic plan to D1 or
Okay.
B1 or anything.
Okay.
So now my question, can I add a slot without going to production plan?
No, you cannot. You have to go to production plan to add a slot.
Yes, sir. So we
You have
cannot
to
go
base.
to. Yes,
No, you cannot go to the. You cannot go to, let's say. Sorry, you cannot add a slot in a normal plan. Reason being, it doesn't support it. So if you look at the pricing model, that's what it tells you really. Just plan. So if I go
okay.
here and if I want to create an access plan out here, let's take a look at this. Let's say demo RG, and I'll just go and give some name out here, and let's see, change size, and let's check this out. F1 doesn't support the plans. D1 doesn't support, let's say, slots. B1 also does. B1 doesn't support slots. B2, B3 doesn't support slots out there. You have to go to production model in order to, let's say, take the slots. So you cannot have a basic plan and still want slots out there. You cannot do that. You have to go into production. You have to jump into production, and S1 is the minimum plan that actually supports a slot out there as such.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Yes. Any more questions, guys?
Sir, good morning, sir.
Good, please.
Sir, in Friday session, we have seen, how to develop and build, publish, and everything. We have seen deployment
Mhm.
starts, how to swap and everything we have seen, right?
Correct.
So, this entire thing done by the developer or a DevOps engineer?
Now, this entire thing is done by the DevOps engineer. When you say the entire thing done, what is the entire thing out here? Is that to create the app service, to create the app service plans, to create the slots, to swap the slots. All these things are done by the DevOps engineer. Code is
Okay,
developed by the developer. Code is something that you don't develop.
okay, okay, okay. Sir. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Any more questions, guys?
Sir, in the ad slot section, what is the clone setting?
I'm sorry, or I'm not able to hear your voice. Can you please come again?
In the ad slot section, what is the clone setting? Clone
Okay.
setting.
What is the clone? A good
Yeah.
question. Clone is nothing but just making a copy of your existing app service. So you can clone, meaning if when you're migrating, let's say, an app service, you can do a clone of the existing app service, place it under a different app service plan, and probably delete the existing app service out here. Clone is nothing but just making a copy of it. That's it.
Oh, thank you.
No problem. Yes, any more questions, guys? Okay. So let's take a look at a couple of concepts today, and let's go ahead with the journey this particular week. So what I want to do today is this. See, I have some structured data. When I say structured data, data represented in proper tabular format, proper tables and rows, or proper, let's say, rows and columns. So I would say structured data. CTURD, structured data. Structured data out here. And what kind of a data I have is something like this. I have data like, for example, I have a serial number, a column called serial number, and a column called course name, and another column called course rating. So I'm just trying to, let's say, draw a table for all the courses offered by the institution along with the rating that particular course has. So for example, I have something like one serial number one, and at serial number 1 year, I have a course name called something like AZ104. Let's say Azure 104 administration. Rating is something like 4.5 or something like this. I then have a course called AZ400. Multiple courses. AZ400 out here, and something like 4.8 or something like this. So I have multiple courses that are offered by the institution, which I want to place it in the form of a table which contains rows and columns, so that if you are a student, if you want to check out, let's say, you want to see all the courses that are rated above 4.4.5. So you'll be simply able to query it, telling, okay, fine, this is 4.8, belonging to what AZ400, and the serial number is 2. This is the second course offered by the institution. So like this, the institution can offer you multiple courses. Multiple things out here is what you can do out here as such. Now I want to store all this particular data inside Azure. Now I have data. I want to store all this data inside Azure out here. So what service can you think about to hold this particular data?
SQL databases.
Okay.
SQL databases, or normally databases out here
Yep.
for structured
Yeah.
data. For unstructured data, we dealt with something called as a storage account. We said in a storage account, you can hold all the unstructured data. You can place all the unstructured data like videos, MP3s, files, and all that stuff. For a structured data, I want to store all this data within something called as a SQL or an SQL database. I'll say this is a SQL database out here. I want to store all this data into an SQL database, and I also want to expose this data over the internet. We'll talk about that. But there are two things that we need to, let's say, look at. One is how do you store the data? Second is how do you expose the data? Two things is what I'm, let's say, looking at. Now, in order to store the data, I'll start going through something called as an SQL database out here. And in order to create an SQL database, there is a service called SQL Azure. There are altogether services which are called SQL Azure out here, wherein Azure expects you to create something called as an SQL server. SQL server is like an app service plan, meaning SQL server will power your, let's say, databases, will give you the compute power and etc. And under one particular SQL database, sorry, under one particular SQL server, you can have multiple databases. So it is like this. So I'm giving you the overview of the structure. So one, you have the SQL server. Under an SQL server, you can have multiple databases out here. SQL server is like an app service plan, which gives you the required compute memory, which will give you the RAM, hardware, and etc. to process your request. Under which you can have something called as an SQL database. So all these are SQL databases out here. Under a database is where you can start creating something called as tables. Under each and every database, you can have multiple tables out here. And under the table, you can inject your data using SQL commands. You can inject your data out here. So my intention is not to go through the SQL commands again. We are, as a DevOps engineering team, we are not expected to have a knowledge on SQL commands, but on the SQL infrastructure, meaning how do you create this infrastructure and how do you maintain this infrastructure is where we come into picture. So what I'll do is today I'll just go here and I again, if you see, I do not have a resource group, nothing I have right now. So what I'll do is I'll search for SQL. So if I do SQL, right, I have something like SQL database, I have SQL server, I have SQL virtual machines, meaning you can create a virtual machine and you can also, let's say, deploy your SQL servers out there, which is which is, let's say, an infrastructure as a service model. We'll talk about what is infrastructure as a service model. I think we talked about infrastructure as a service model out here as such. Today, what I'll do is that I'll go with SQL databases. I click on SQL databases out here and I'll say create. Again, it's going to ask me questions like what is the subscription in which you want to create this database? What is the resource group? I'll say this is a data tier RG. Okay. It's asking me what is the name of the database. I'll give the name something like testdb. Test database, test DB out here. Then it's asking me under which server you want to create it. Same like when you create a web app, right? It's first going to ask you what is the name of the web app, then the app service plan. In the same way, here is asking you what is the name of the database. Give me any name. Now select a server. I don't have a server. I'll create one. I'll say create new. Now it's telling me, okay, fine. Give me a name of the server, and as and when you give the name of the server, I will, as in Microsoft will give a fully qualified domain name for the server called .database.windows.net. So whatever is your name, .database.windows.net will become the fully qualified domain name. This is what will happen. So I'll just go ahead, do that. I'll say this is demo server abc000, something like this. Again, the name should not be, the name should be available. The name cannot contain hyphens. The name should be unique and all these things. So I said demo server abc000.azurewebsites.net. I'll take the server in ECS2 because this is where I have the capacity to create in my subscription. So I'll take it in ECS2. I'll just scroll down and here it's telling what kind of an authentication you want. Meaning if you want to log into this particular server, you need to give me some kind of an email ID and password, right? So I'll say yes, please use SQL Server authentication, and then I have something called user ID and password section out here. Just like when we are creating a virtual machine, you have user ID password. So let's do that. Say something like this user. Let's give some passwords out here. So I have given a password. I have retyped the same password. So what I did is that I just created a server which is called demo server abc000.databases.windows.net in a location called ECS2. I'm using an ID and a password. I'll say OK. I'll scroll down. It's telling, do you want to use Elastic Pool? There's a concept called Elastic Pool. Will come down to that. For now, I'll say no. And I'll say the environment. Since I am developing things, I'm testing things out. I'll say it is development. I'll scroll down. Now it's asking me, since this is a database, you will have to tell me how big or how small of a database you need. In storage account, did it ask me any size and etc.? Did we create any size for the storage account? While creating the storage account, did we mention any size anywhere?
No.
No, exactly. We haven't mentioned it. It has a maximum capacity of 500 terabytes. So that's the data that you can hold. But when you create an SQL, you are asked for a size. And again, there are different models that are available while you are going for, let's say, something called as a SQL database out here. First thing, it's called vCore purchasing model, virtual core capacity purchasing model. The other thing is called a DTU based model, data transaction unit model out here. Again, if you click on if you click on learn more, this is what it will tell you. Is that virtual core purchasing model the most recommended thing? This purchasing model provides a choice between the provisioned compute and the serverless compute out here. So what it really tells you out here is very simple. It's telling you that if you go for a vCore model, I'll give you some virtual core capacity in the background. Just like when you create a virtual machine, you have 2 core virtual machines, 3 core virtual machines, and all these things. In the same way, when you go for something called as a vCore model, there is something called minimum core and maximum cores out here. When it is telling you, I can go maximum up to 80 core capacity. This tells you that minimum I'll start with 10 cores. Depending upon the amount of requests that are coming to your database, I will scale up or scale down. So there is a minimum limit, there is a maximum limit out here based on which you are charged. It's telling you, per, let's say, the database allocation or per your amount of memory allocation, you will be charged some price. So that's what it is telling you right now, is that general purpose something cost per GB is about what, 8.29, and also the cost per core capacity will also vary. So depending upon this, it's telling that, okay, fine, you know what, this is the configuration, this is the charge that you will have. And you also have something like hyperscale and business critical model or business critical options here, higher capacities out there. But what we can do for our testing, we can go for a DTU based model, data transaction unit model, which is a lesser capacity model out here. Now it's telling in a DTU model, right? It's telling this is the model which bundles compute and gives you a balanced common workload, meaning here you do not have a lot of choice. Here Microsoft is mixing and matching and giving you something. In a vCore model, you have a choice to tell how many cores you need. In a DTU based model, you do not have that particular option, which is generally not used for production based systems, which is for development, like we are doing development, right? So what I'll do is I'll say I'll go for a DTU model. I'll go for basic. I'll simply go for a basic model out here, which gives me something like this. The maximum data that I can store is 2 GB with 5 DTUs. In a very simple way, again, if you see, it's telling me that 70 rupees cost per DTU into 5 DTU, what is it? 352 rupees per month, which is the least, let's say, database that you can go for. Again, very simple, one DTU will help you in one transaction. When I say one transaction, see, at the end of the day, you will be creating a SQL database. You will be reading the data from this particular database. You will also be writing the data here, right? So it's a read or a write operations that you actually perform here. One DTU can help you do one read or one write. One DTU can help you do one read or one write parallelly, which means 5 DTUs can help you parallelly perform 5 read or 5 write or a combination of 5 read and write operations. So this is what a DTU model really gives you out here, which is very basic, but which is good for me to, let's say, start my journey with. I'll say apply. I'm telling this is basic, and here redundancy. Did you see this anywhere? Storage accounts,
Storage
LRS,
account.
ZRS, CRS. Same concept applies here also. It's telling, you know what, I'll give you a backend storage out here with LRS or something. I'll say, okay, I'm good with that. I'll say next, networking. And here it is telling you how do you want to connect to this particular database, because at the end of the day, after I go ahead and create the database, I want to connect to it to inject the data and all these things. I'll say, you know what, go for a public endpoint for now, and allow Azure services, yes. Allow the client IP address, meaning allow myself to go ahead and, let's say, access this database. For now, I'll say no. I'll just put this as no. I'll just come down connection policy or minimum TLS version. I'm not touching this out. Security, I'm not really touching. Additional settings, not really touching this out. Tags review and create this out here. So what I'm doing right now is I'm creating two things. One is a SQL server. The other is a SQL database. In a DTO model, I'm giving like about 5 DTOs basically initially. A basic database basically I'm creating. And in the firewall settings, I said public endpoints. And I said please allow Azure services to connect to this particular database out here. Now, this is going to take around 2 to 3 minutes of time in order to create the entire database out here, probably more than that, because you will have to create the server, you'll have to create the database, you'll have to also provision the database out here. But my intention is this: once the database is created, I want to go ahead and start putting my data inside the database. Now, unlike a storage account, which is a NoSQL storage account is called as a NoSQL storage, which means you don't have to write any commands to go ahead and inject your data. Simply you can click on the upload button, take all your files, upload it out. That's what a NoSQL really means out here. That's what a NoSQL mechanism really means out here. But since we are dealing with a SQL database out here, the data is stored in the form of tables. So you will need to have a little bit of basics, not that great, a little bit of basics of something called as an SQL language. Because in order for this demo, only for this demo, that's the reason I'm telling, only for this demo, in order for you to complete this demo, you need to understand how to create a table inside a database. Because up till now we've shown how to create a server, then created a database. After that we are creating what? Tables. In order to create tables, you need to have the basic of something called as an SQL language out here. So for example, if you say create table in SQL, any website you go is going to give you some command. That this is an SQL command out here telling create table, name of the table, the column and the data type, meaning what kind of a data are you really injecting. And after, for example, this is how it looks like. So it's telling create table, table name is called persons, and name, last, and all that stuff. Then you have, if you want to, let's say, inject the data inside the table, you will have something called a command called insert into table SQL. It will tell you how do you inject the data. For example, here you have a demo table out here, which is telling you insert into table name values value 1, 2, and 3. It's telling you how to inject it. How to inject, let's say, the values here is something that you have. So taking these two commands, I want to inject some data which will look like this. Serial number, course name, course rating 1, something like this. This is something that I want to inject into. For which again, you don't have to go to any different website. I'll also give you the documentation for it, which we have written, which we normally use out there. So let me go there and let me give you the page that I'll refer to, and let us see what really happens out here as such. Let's say SQL, and I'll give you some generic commands that you can really play around with. So I'll just send it across in this particular window right now. So let me go ahead and use the chat to send this across. So please take this out. This is a link that I'm providing, which is a text file out here. It's a txt file, which will just give you some basic commands out here so that you can just go ahead look at this demo again. It's not rocket science, very simple. Firstly, it's creating a table. Secondly, is injecting everything into that particular table. Like for example, AZ204 or AZ303, DP203, different courses along with their rating. This is what I'm trying to do out here as such. And if you see, and if I go into my resource group, this is what got created. One is a SQL server, the other is a SQL database that got created. So the type is SQL server, here the type is SQL database in a location called East US2 is what I went ahead and created out here. Now what I want to do is that I want to now start injecting the data, but before that, any questions still here that I can take? Anyone, any questions that I can take till here?
So at max, how many databases we can create in a
Uh, there is no maximum limit of how many databases that you can actually create inside a server. You can have any number of databases, and in the each and every database, you can have any number of tables also. So databases and tables, they work together in sync that way.
Hello, Abhishek, good morning.
Good, please.
Yeah, Abhishek, one silly question I have, is this all interlinked to each other, like storage account, resource group, database, SQL, is everything?
Everything, yes, is interlinked to each other. Yes.
Like suppose as I am a client, so in
hmm
which way I'll be coming to your organizations? In that way, if you can explain one or two line.
Can you come again with the question? I'm sorry.
Like suppose I am a client, you are providing
hmm
all the services.
hmm
So what will be my questions?
What will be your question depends upon the application that you're trying to build. Is depending upon what kind of an application you're building. Depending upon that, you will have questions that what kind of a services that I need to create, or how is the
Yes,
interlink
exactly.
between the services out here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we'll see in this particular example on how the interlink actually works out here. So my intention is just not to explain the databases; it is also to interlink with the database with the app service and so on and so forth.
Suppose, for example, I'm creating an application just like a Dream 11. So, what kind of things I have to take? What kind of services I have to take from your end?
1 second, sorry. Let me use my headset. Yes. Go ahead, please. Can you come
Suppose
again
I'm
with the
creating
question?
an applications like Dream 11.
Mm,
So, what kind of services I'll be taking from your end? One, I understand
Suppose.
that storage I need.
Okay. No,
Uh,
you
uh,
don't need a. You don't always need a storage again. That's what I was telling you. Is that it completely depends upon the application that you're building. It completely depends upon the requirement that you have. For example, if you say that you know what you're building an application, my question
mm,
again would be like, what kind of an application would you need?
can you
Like, for
elaborate it?
example,
Mm,
again, if I elaborate on that, it will become a little bit of into the architecture. Our duty as a DevOps engineer is to not give an architectural guidance, but to go
mm,
ahead and implement what the architecture really tells you. But if I were an architect, I would ask you questions like what kind of an application that you're building? Where do you want to deploy this particular application in? What are your primary customer base? What kind of a data that you are really getting into picture? And if it's a structured data, I would suggest let's say some kind of a database. If it's unstructured, I would suggest let's say something like storage accounts and etc. to hold your data. And then things like security, like what kind of a security do you want? Do you want this to be a public application, or do you just want this to be a private application? This is all the work of an architecture. Once they design the solution, we as DevOps team, we implement the solution out there for the architecture out there. So it completely depends upon what kind of a service that you're really going for out there as such.
okay, so basically, architecture will ask us that I need one SQL database, or he will be asking us that create one storage
He
account,
will
and
be
this is
telling us to
required.
create a service. He will not be
Yeah.
asking us. He will be telling us to create something.
Okay, sorry. So we will be creating that and we'll be giving it to the architecture, right?
He will be giving it to the client, or let's say the architect. Yes, yes,
Okay, so all these things we have to learn. Only the thing is that as per the architect, we have to design and give it to them.
correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Again, we are not into design and implement. We are not into design, guys. We are rather into implementation. So design is something that will be taken care by the architecture. So there's altogether a separate examination for that called AZ 303 and 304 Azure Solution Architect, which they will consider all these things like what are the requests and what is the traffic, depending upon that, giving you the size, giving you the location, and so on and so forth. We will be implementing it, but in this example, we'll be see how the implementation really works. I, as an architecture, will try to design my solution out here as such. So using these examples, I would just give you a model of how it is elaborated or how it is executed and so on and so forth.
Okay.
Yes, any more questions, guys?
Sir, I have one question, sir.
Go ahead, please.
Sir, under storage account we have tables, files, file shares, and everything is there. No?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that tables is used for to hold the semi-structured data, right? Right here,
That's a semi-structured data. Yes, it's a NoSQL semi-structured data. Yes,
here for here to store relational data. So you're using tables in this,
correct,
right? Okay,
correct.
okay, sir. Okay,
This is all
thank you.
relational data right now that I'm using.
Okay, sir. Thank
Okay, so I have the server created. So if you look at this, this is the demo server, something like this. And this is a server name called demo server abc000.databases.windows.net. This is the server that I have. And then the admin user called test user. This is the user that I do have. And if I just scroll down to the left, I have something like SQL databases. So if I go into SQL databases, I have one database called test database that is online. And then there is something called networking, wherein all the Azure services are allowed to, let's say, communicate with this particular database. And by default, without even telling, your SQL server comes with a firewall. Your SQL servers come with a firewall, meaning they come with some pre-networking enabled out here, which means they are normally not exposed to the internet traffic. Meaning I as a user coming from the internet won't be able to communicate with my SQL server until or unless I am allowed to. We'll talk about what this is. So they come with a default firewall out here, which means that if I want to interact with a database, just go back. I'll go into my database out here. In order to interact with a database, there is something called as query editor. I'll say go here, called query editor out here. It's asking me, give me your user ID and give me your password. And I'll say the user ID is test user and the password is something like this. And this is what is the error that I'll get. Selling cannot open server, something like that requested by the login. Client IP is not allowed to access the server. To enable, use the Azure portal and run, let's say, something called as a firewall out there. Allow this IP to be whitelisted. It's telling, you know what, you're working from an IP called 115.98.220.244.69. Same thing I'll get if I go into Google and say what's my IP. Process. Let's put here telling what's my IP. So same thing. This is the IP address that I'm working from, and this IP address should be allowed to be communicated with that particular, let's say, SQL server out here. So what I'll do again is that I'll come back into the SQL server, and there is something called networking inside the SQL server out here. In here, I will say add your current IP address. This is my current IP address 115, something like this. I'll say save. So now it's telling updating the firewall rules for this particular SQL server. Once the rule is updated, I can go here and I can say coming here called query editor again, and I can say give the password here, and I'm inside my SQL server or inside my SQL database. And inside the database, what do we have, guys? Tables. But I have not created any tables, right? So if I go back here, in the left hand corner, you have something called what? Tables. Click on this. No tables at all. Tables are like containers inside your storage account. It's like, yes, not blobs, it's the container inside the storage account out here. Inside your container is where you have your blobs. Tables is like the empty containers out here that you need to create. For this, what I'll do is again, I was showing the query, right? To create a table. And I'm creating a table called course. This is the name of the table. So I'll just copy this query, come back here. Again, to write the queries is not our duty. Our duty is to go ahead, create the infrastructure, provision the infrastructure, maintain the security of the infrastructure, and etc. Writing the queries is not our duty. It's either a developer or a SQL database administrator who needs to write the query. But since we need to understand a little bit of queries for this particular demo, what I'm doing right now is I'm creating a table called create table what? course with three different columns called course ID, course name, and rating, and their respective data types. Integer, character, maximum up to 1000 limit, meaning my name of the course can go maximum up to what? 1000 characters in limit. Then something called rating, meaning rating can be something like, if it's saying 2 comma 1, I can have something like 3.5 or 4.5 or 1.2, something like that. I'll say hit the run button here. Selling what? Query succeeded. Now if you see, just refresh this out, go into something called tables. You have what? DBO dot course, database object called course, which is a table or database object of a type called table with the name called what? Course out here is what I have. And what I can do right now, I now want to see what is there inside this particular course table. I want to see whether there is any data or something. In order to see that, again, you cannot visually see it. You will have to run a query called select. I'm selecting everything called star from something called dbo.course. What I'm doing is that I'm saying select everything. I'm saying select everything, or you can say select top 100, top 1000, something like that. But what I'm doing is I'm saying select star, meaning everything from something called dbo.course. And if you go into the results, I have what? Course ID, course name, rating, three different columns out here with no data inside it. It's an empty table. If I want to now insert records out there, I have the second command to call insert into. I'll just copy all these three commands out here. Just go back, paste it. This is what I have. Telling insert into course, meaning please go ahead insert into that particular table called course, where you have three columns called what? Course ID, course name, rating, whose values are something like this, some dummy values. I'll say run. String what? Three rows affected because I have what? Three different queries, three different insert statements. And if I now run again called select star from db.course, now I have what? Course ID, course name, and then the rating with the respective data out here. For example, let's say that you only want data whose rating is equal to, let's say, something like 4.6. You can give here telling where rating is equal to 4.6, something similar to this. Let's say equal to this is how you get the selected data, meaning it's a source query language, meaning you're querying the data. SQL is nothing but source query language, which means you're querying the data that is inside the table and you want to print out the result. It's a SQL database out here for which you need these basic commands out here, which are already there inside this particular text document out here as such. So now what I did is I created my SQL database. I now have some data inside this particular SQL database in the form of rows, columns, and all these are in the form of tabular structure that is sitting inside the database out here. Now let's say that you have referred one of your friends to this particular institute. Okay, you said, you know what, one of your friend is coming to this institute out here and he's coming to my institute. He's asking, I want to see a list of all your courses that you're offering along with the rating. Can you tell me where I can go to see this? What should I say? All the data is where? Where is it sitting in?
Table.
In the table. So if this particular person that you have referred to wants to look at all the data, where should he ideally go?
Query. I'll
Where
go
do
to
you think
database.
he should go to database? which means that if your friend is coming, I have to give him the ID and password to my database, telling that fine, telling that you know what, please go ahead, use something called as test user. Go to Azure. If you're not a user in Azure, I'll add you to my Azure portal. Go to that particular Azure portal, use test user, go into that particular SQL database, run a query called select star from dbo.course, which will give you all the courses and you can decide what you want to. Do you think your friend will even join my institute if I tell all these things? Because
Maybe may not be.
he may not, definitely he will not. I'm pretty sure he will not. Very simple is that, very simple is that I have done all these things. My data is there inside the database. Everything is, let's say, finalized and all that stuff. But I cannot give you the user ID and password to my database. What is the guarantee that you don't go ahead and delete the data? What is the guarantee that you don't go ahead and, let's say, alter the data out here? I'm now telling that this particular person should be simply going to a website. You know, he should not come through all these things. Something like www.precisend.com, something like this, right? If he goes here, he should simply be able to see all the data being displayed, which means this website called www.precisend.com should be hosted somewhere, meaning that this particular website should be hosted somewhere. When I say hosted somewhere, can you think about any service in Azure that you can host a website?
App service.
App service,
Service or
exactly. Which now means that I will now get an app service and an app service plan into the picture, right? I will say I have an app service, I have an app service plan, which is helping me host this particular website called precising.com, and this app service name can be something like precise.azurewebsites.net. And this is how the flow should work right now. I, as a user, am visiting to this particular website called precising.com. This website called precising.com should redirect me to something called precising.azurewebsites.net, and the code that is running on top of this particular app service. This is all your backend, not visible to the user at all. The code that is running in the backend should internally talk to the SQL database, get all the data, and send it to the client over the browser. This is the working model that I'm now proposing, for which I am planning to use all these services called a DNS name. Probably this is not the DNS name I have. I have an alternative website name. I want to link my website to the existing .azurewebsites.net, to the existing domain name that Azure gives me, and I want to establish a link between my app service and my SQL database out here, so that only this particular app service talks to the SQL database. Anyone else coming from the internet will be blocked. So I am getting data, I'm getting applications, I'm also getting security into picture to build a complete solution out here. This is what is the idea that I'll be proposing over the next couple of classes. And once this is done, we'll also go into something called monitoring. So the next 4 or 5 classes, right? You can think that this is like a mini project work, or let's say a mini application building on how things work in the organization. So we have looked into virtual networks, we have looked into all these things. Now what I'll do is I'm trying to interlink all those things together right now in order to give you a complete solution. And in the DevOps section of the course, we will try to see how to automate all this infrastructure and create it using a CI/CD pipeline, and then deploy your code and all that stuff out here as such. So this is what I have over a couple of classes. So I'll hold here before I move forward, because I need to create the app service plan. I need to create a code. I also need to, let's say, see how the app service works with the SQL database, and then finally expose it over a domain and all these things out. So there are a couple of things that are coming ahead in this particular lecture, in this particular demo. So before I going there, any questions that I can take till here?
Hello, Abhishek.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so just now we went into networking. Can you please go into that tab, networking, onto the SQL database?
On to the SQL database. No, it's on the SQL
Yeah,
server, which is under networking. Let's go
sorry,
there.
SQL servers, yes. So we have allowed our own IP, right?
Yes, we are allowing
So
our own IP. Yes.
how it is going to work? Every clients will get these options to allow, or I did not get this point.
And can you come again, please?
I'm saying that as you are using it, right? You have
Hmm.
created. So you yourself has allowed your own IP.
Yes.
Then how client will be using it?
Client will not use this. I won't give the client at all. I won't let the client at all use the backend database. That's the entire point of it, right? The entire point of it is to expose your entire data over the internet or
Okay,
over an intranet.
suppose for
Hmm.
example, I am working. I have created this. Okay,
Okay.
and I have created for you. Example, I've
Okay.
created for you. At the
Hmm.
end of the day, you'll be getting that the last output. You'll be getting it, right?
Sorry, at the end of
You
the day, can you come
like
again, please?
once the creation is completed, you'll be getting some
Hmm.
website like www.presin.in. Okay,
Hmm.
you'll be going over there, and I myself has allowed my own IP. Then I am able to create it. So tomorrow, if I am not available,
Okay.
then if somebody wants to do any kind of modifications on place of me,
Okay.
how he is going to do it?
Then there are ways to access it. We'll talk about that. There are ways to access your database out there. Not directly though, but indirectly
Mhm.
there are ways to access your database, which will talk about how do you gain a direct access to your database out there. So either you
Okay,
whitelist the IP of the client, or you add something called as a virtual network rule. Allow the allow the client to, let's say, use a virtual network or use a virtual machine as a part of your network. Any one of the solutions out there as such.
okay. So currently, as I am creating, I have an options to allow my IP, and then only I'll be able to create everything. Otherwise, I'll
Yes,
not be
if
able
you
to
have
log
a
in.
client IP, well, if you have your own client IP, you can
Mhm.
add their IP address as well here. You can say client IP.
Okay, more than one I can add it over there.
You can add up to, let's say, about 200 or 300 IPs out here as such. Just
Okay.
like the way you did in a storage account. You
Mhm.
can add a different IP. Here, I have an option to add my own IP. Also, I have an option to add others' IP as well. So if I have a
Okay.
client called client as it underscore developer underscore sorry developer, and I can take that particular developer's IP telling 20.1.8.9 something like this. I can add their IP as well. Depending upon their IP address, I can whitelist their IP. I can say save. So now I as well as the developer now has the access to the database. And if they have the ID and password, they can go ahead and they can go ahead and connect to this particular database out here as such.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
No problem. Any more questions, guys?
Sir, when we create the server, so does it automatically create the backup services or we have to create?
Does it automatically create the backup services? No, we will have to define the backup services. There are no backups basically that are created out here. Right now, it's just a test database out here as such. You will have to define
Okay.
what is the policy. By default, you have a seven
Okay.
day retention policy, but you can create your own policies out here as such.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
No problem. Yes, any more questions, guys? So this is what we will try to do over a period of time is that today I just injected or I just have, let's say, a service called database. Tomorrow we'll be creating an app service and seeing how to connect that particular app service to the database, and then finally going into something called security, mon- monitoring, and also something as your custom domain names and all these things. By giving these examples, I'm trying to cover concepts like app services and let's say something like networking and app service, something like networking in SQL databases and all these things. So that's the real intention behind these lectures out here as such. Yes, any more questions, guys? Okay, no further questions, and that's it from my end today. We'll meet tomorrow, and we'll start talking about the application tier and how do you create the app services, how do you connect them, and how do they work how do they work interconnected with each other, and so on and so forth. Thank you, and have a good day ahead.